Hello, everyone, and welcome to another yet very special episode of Superheroes of Arabia podcast. Today, I have with me, I want to call him a Spider Man legend, but his body of work uh, forces me to not say that because he has done not only a great deal of critically acclaimed work for our friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, but he has done a good amount of work for DC Comics character. One of them was showcased in the Black Adam movie, and I'm going to be explaining it later on. Plus, he has recently started his Kickstarter campaign for Spellbound Comics, a portfolio of independent comic books, which are not only written by Mr. J.M. DeMatteis, but also he has brought on board another legend, Mr. Tom DeFalco. So please join me in welcoming the DC and Marvel legend, Mr. Spellbound Comics, Mr. J.M. DeMatteis.
Hello, how are you?
I'm doing great, sir, and thank you very much. It means a lot for me and my community that you took out the time to talk to us.
Oh, I'm happy to do it. It's an amazing thing that we can sit here like this. It's amazing to me that the stories reach across the world, let alone that we can now sit and talk like this across the world. It's a great thing. I'm happy to be here.
The pleasure is ours, and you are absolutely right. These are, I would say, the blessings of modern technology that we are in, because when I was reading the works that you were doing back in the 80s, all I could do was just read your name and just imagine that one day maybe I might be in New York City and I might be able to meet Mr. DeMatteis, Mr. Tom DeFalco, Mr. Jim Shooter, all the writers who have been my favorites. But thanks to the technology right now, we have you on our podcast, sir. Mr. DeMatteis, basically, your work has a lot of influences from classic literature. And you know how to touch on the emotional side of a character. Now, before I talk about the individual stories where you actually brought out these very intriguing, very thought-provoking aspects of our favorite superheroes, I want to know who is Mr. J.M. DeMatteis and when was the first time he fell in love with superheroes?
First time I fell in love with superheroes. That's a great question. I grew up in New York City and Brooklyn with a working class family. And it's a funny thing. People often ask me, what's the first comic book you ever read? And I have no idea.
Right.
Because I remember always reading them. When I was a kid growing up in New York, first of all, you didn't have to go to a comic shop to get comic books.
Right.
There were just stores everywhere that sold them. And you could just, we had what we called a candy store. It was like a soda fountain. They sold magazines and newspapers and toys and this and that. And that's where I bought my comics. It was like 3 blocks from my house. I'd make the little pilgrimage and I would go buy my comics every week. And so comics were just always around. And so I don't really remember the first one I ever read. I just know that from a very young age, I completely fell in love with the form. I often say that for people that love comics, it's almost as if there's some special chemical in our brain. And when the first time we see that magical combination of words and pictures, that chemical goes bloop, and our eyes light up and we're hooked for life. We can't help ourselves. For the rest of our lives, we're going to read this stuff because there's something about that combination that fills our hearts and activates our minds, and it's just magic. And it's always been there for me. And thank God it's never gone away.
Okay, but that's a very fair description you gave about your first experience, and this is something which is quite relatable across the globe. In my case, I was fortunate enough to remember, maybe because my parents had made me acquainted with Superman, maybe. So that's why when I saw an image on a wall in a toy store here in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, the first time when I saw it, I was mesmerized by it. But okay, if we move from that point onwards, where that moment came about, what is the first comic book that you remember, or your first superhero that really you said, man, I really need to read more about this?
I remember when I was young, in terms of the other interesting thing when I was a kid was that there were many kinds of comics. The superheroes didn't dominate the market. So there were superhero comics, there were funny animal comics, there were Archie comics, there were comics based on TV shows and movies and different kinds of adventure comics. So you could just go and get anything, but I did love the superheroes. And the ones that I loved the most that I remember from my childhood, I have to think, Superman. Superman was always there.
Right.
And, Superman is this universal symbol somehow he's become. I almost think that, our collective unconscious creates these symbols, and then someone gets the message and puts them in a story. It's like it starts with us and then goes out into the story. But Superman seems to resonate around the world, and certainly resonated with me.
Right.
As did Batman, in an era before Batman was, it was I guess the end of what they would call the Silver Age. So Batman still was a little goofy, with that squared jaw. It was signed by Bob. So, Dick Sprang. I love Dick Sprang. And then my other two favorites were Green Lantern.
Mm-hmm.
I always loved, because I just thought, and I think to this day, the whole concept that with your personal will and your imagination, you can create anything. That's not just a great metaphor for a story; it's a great metaphor for life. So I always loved Green Lantern, and Gil Kane, for some reason, even in a time when the artists' names weren't always on the story, somehow I always knew who Gil Kane was and loved Gil Kane. And then the other thing I loved was the Justice League, because how could a kid not love a story where all these guys are in this story together having these adventures?
No doubt.
Those are the ones when I was young that I really loved. I didn't read Marvel very much at that point, although the one Marvel book that I did read when I was probably 9 years old or so was Sergeant Fury, which is funny to me now, because my view on war and militarism is like pacifism across the board. But when I was a kid, I loved war comics. I just loved war comics. I read all the DC war comics, Sergeant Rock and all those, the Haunted Tank. And the only Marvel book that I read was Sergeant Fury. And that was, especially the early Kirby issues. Those are really powerful stories. And that was the first place I ever saw, since you were wearing that shirt, first place I ever saw Captain America was in an issue of Sergeant Fury.
Let me Sorry, please continue.
Yeah. So, and I remember like, whoa, who is this? I had never heard of Captain America. And he was an old hero from the 40s. And when, I'm a kid and say it's the early 60s, the 1940s felt like they were like 1,000 years ago. They seemed like so long ago. So here is this interesting, weird character with a flag on his shirt, And then when I was in about the seventh grade, when I was about 12 years old, Marvel was really taking off. And all my friends were talking about Marvel. So I said, all right, let me go take a look at these books. I had seen some of them years before, but they almost looked a little too creepy and scary for me. The art in the DC books in those days, Kurt Swan and Dick Sprang, it was very clear and clean and sculpted. And then you look at the early Marvel books and Kirby stuff, it's like in your face. And, I remember reading a Hulk comic and I wasn't sure, the real people looked like monsters. So which one was the Hulk, And Steve Ditko's stuff on Spider-Man was so creepy, that it really kind of put me off when I was younger. But then when I was in the seventh grade, I went out and I picked up a bunch of the Marvels, and there went that chemical again dropping in my brain. And it was like, oh my God, I must read all of these and I must read them now. And I was hooked from then on.
I'm glad you highlighted my t-shirt, because I wore this t-shirt for a very specific reason. Since you are from Brooklyn.
Yeah.
And Steve Rogers is also from Brooklyn. But it highlighted something very important, because I was expecting that you might name Captain America as like the starting point for your comic book journey. But in fact, your starting point was with the main A-list characters of DC Comics.
Yeah.
And it's perfectly understandable. But despite the fact that you have now identify yourself as a Bertrand Russell type pacifist, do you feel any pride in like Captain America? Steve Rogers is from Brooklyn as well as I am.
Oh, I wrote Captain America for 3 years. I love Captain America. And you know, the great thing about Captain America that I really love is that he's like Peter Parker in a lot of ways, in that he's a truly good and decent man. He's not a violent. I mean, the character was born in World War II, but that's not who Captain America is. He's not a warrior in that sense. I never saw him that way. Nor does he represent the American reality, because
Right.
you know, with any country, there's a gap between the reality and the ideals of a country.
True.
Captain America is the embodiment of all our highest aspirations as a country, and I think as a world.
True.
So I love Captain America. Fantastic character. You know, some characters, you like them as a reader, and then you discover when you're writing them, you find a whole other way that you connect with them. And I really fell in love with Steve Rogers and that character writing Captain America for 3 years. I appreciated him in a way that I never had just as a reader.
Just as a reader. And it's interesting you made the point, because knowing all the politics that has gone around in the Middle East vis-a-vis all the potential flashpoints we have, this is the beauty about Captain America, that even like I still remember that back in the 1980s, the first costumes that ever landed in Saudi Arabia, especially in my city in Jeddah, for children. So you had Superman, you had Batman, you had Spider-Man, and the fourth one happened to be Captain America.
Interesting.
And despite Captain America, you know, having the name America so loud, describing him, he is one of the most loved characters, even here. Not just.
That's so interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's because of what we're talking about, because he represents the best in all of us, the part of all of us that wants to always to do the right thing, to be compassionate, to be kind, to help the little guy, to help the people that are in trouble, you know?
Exactly.
Yeah. And that's why and in that way, he's very similar, although in a very different way. He and Superman have a lot of parallels that way. Superman isn't about how strong Superman is, or that he can incinerate something with his heat vision. Superman is about the fact that he is a good and decent man who has the power to do a lot of harm in the world if he wanted to, but always chooses to do good, always chooses to help. And that's an aspiration. And to me, these characters represent not something outside of ourselves, but something inside ourselves that we have. They're a projection of the best in all of us.
I couldn't agree more with you, sir. And but you know, like you have just highlighted, that you started to appreciate Captain America even more because when you were viewing him as a reader, your point of view was different. But when you started writing Captain America, you had an altogether different look about him. And in that respect, you know, there are a lot of things that shape us into becoming who we are. Now, we know that an adolescent JM DeMatteis gets exposed to all the comics, gets exposed to this entire culture. He is also introduced to Marvel. He comes across Captain America. From that point onwards, obviously, you come from humble beginnings. Your parents might have pressured you into getting a degree and, you know, basically get a 9-to-5 job, have a career. Okay. And knowing what I have learned from the interviews of Stan Lee, the late Jack Kirby, the late Stan Lee, or even the likes of Jim Steranko and all, comic book was not a career choice.
No, it wasn't. You know, certainly when I started in the business was more respected than it was in the days of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. Those guys were really, really fighting a battle to get the respect that they deserved. but the thing for me was I was always creative. That's just who I was. From the time I was a little kid, my first love was drawing. I was always drawing. And then
Right.
at a certain point when I was about 10 or 11, I always liked music, but that's when I fell in love with the Beatles. I took guitar lessons. I started playing in bands. I write songs. I sing. So I always had that creative thing going as well. And I always had a natural affinity for writing. So all those things always pushed and pulled me. And I knew from a very, very young age that I would never be able to live in the 9 to 5 world. I just couldn't. I wanted to live a creative life. And I always say, only half jokingly, the reason I succeeded was because God didn't make me good at anything else. I would have been such a failure out in the world. So I had to follow my dreams. And one of the things I often say to people, say in my writing classes, and I think it's really, really important, if you have a passion in your life, say it's a creative passion,
Right.
follow that passion, follow that dream. It may not lead you where you expect to go, but if you follow it, it will lead you someplace good. Maybe not the place, maybe it's like, well, I'm going to be an Academy Award winning actor. And you follow that passion for acting. And what you end up being is maybe an acting teacher or a theater teacher. And you find that you get more satisfaction out of that than you ever would have gotten had you become an Academy Award winning actor. But you follow that passion and it led you someplace where you can express that passion and that creativity. So I'm a big believer in following your dreams that way. And that's what I did. I just kept doing it, knocking at the door on all these things until I could break through. And the beauty of comics for me is then it led to all these other careers, working in television, writing movies, live action, animation, writing prose. All these things came because as a kid, whatever it was in me that said, this is what I'm going to do and nobody's going to stop me. Didn't matter if a teacher told me I was going to be a failure. Didn't matter if my parents said, can't you just do this? My parents are very big on, like, growing up in New York, if you got a job as a teacher, you got medical benefits, you got this, you got that, you had security data. I didn't care. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to do what I wanted to do. And I was going to keep banging my head against that wall until I broke it and broke through.
I'm really glad, sir, that you mentioned this part about your parents' ideal choice, because for those of us who grew up in the Middle East, we always thought that people in America were far luckier than us, far, how should I say, freer than us. And yes, to an extent, that is true. But the pressures of family expectations and everything, they still haunted an average American, just like,
Yes.
for example, your parents had a preference for it. So I'm really glad you shared that, because anyone who's going to be watching this and listening to this and they are here and they want to do something in the world of comics, it's a huge source of inspiration. And I'm glad that I think you tweeted about this as well, about following your passion, and
Yes.
it
Yes.
might not lead you to the destination. Okay, so
Just let me say one more thing in terms of,
please.
like, parents and families. My parents were working class people, the children of immigrants. They didn't come from a world where you understood people who wanted to go into the arts. It was so alien to what they were doing, and the life that they lived. And it wasn't so much that they tried to prevent me; they just didn't quite understand it,
Yeah.
And they got to see me, though. My father got to see the beginning of my career. My mother got to see a lot of my career. So at least they could see that, oh, this is a real thing, and you can make money and have a career and raise a family and do all those things they want you to do, and do it by following the thing that you love and not having to get stuck in some job that you will hate for the rest of your
Rest
life.
of your life. Yeah. This is relatable on so many levels, and I'm glad that you shared this very personal thing with all of us. Now, moving on from that point, sir, how did you end up in the comic book industry?
Well, I always, like I said, I was always creative. I always wanted to be in a creative field. I continued playing in bands and doing music. I was always writing. I spent a few years where I would just write every day. Right while I was playing in bands at night, I'd be writing short stories during the day and mailing them out and getting rejections and mailing them out and getting rejections, which is all part of the process, because that's how you learn. Because
Exactly.
every rejection would come with some direction to you. Well, maybe this part was good, but maybe you need to work on this, and you learn and you grow that way. And then my love of music and my love of writing sort of met in the middle, and I became a journalist, a music journalist,
Okay.
reviewing albums, reviewing concerts, interviewing musicians for different papers and newspapers and things. And I always wanted to do comics and really stop. So just so you know, it's important to tell people this. I always say the two things that you need for a career in the arts are a very strong will, just like Green Lantern, and a
Right.
very, very hard head, because there's a lot of rejection along the way. So
Yes.
I think when I was about 18, I had never seen a comic book script in my life. I had no idea what the format was. I wrote up some sample that I'm sure was fairly awful, sent it off to Marvel, just blind, and
Okay.
got back just a horrible rejection letter from it. It was just, I think the guy that read it must have been having a really bad day, because he really, really wasn't very nice in his response to me. So, okay, I put that away. And then, like a year or so later, DC was starting with an apprenticeship program where they're going to bring people in and teach them
Right.
how to do comics. And I thought, well, let me submit some stuff to that. And I had a little bit better idea how to do a comic book. And I look back now, I was like 19 years old. And what an idiot. I decided I was going to write a Justice League story. Well, it's hard enough to learn the form when you're writing about one character, but trying to write a script with all of these characters in it, and I'm sorry that I never kept that script, because I would love to see it today to see what a mess I made of it. But I sent that into DC, and that time got a very, very nice, very, very encouraging letter back from someone at DC. And I didn't get into the program, but just to get that response, just to have someone say, "Hey, I can see what's working in here." That was very encouraging. So that went along, and the big breakthrough came for me a few years later. I put together some samples again for DC, including, as I remember, a Superman story,
Right.
and sent them into DC. And the response I got was, well, we're not going to buy Superman stories from a writer that we never heard of, but Paul Levitz is buying scripts for the anthology books. They used to have like Weird War Tales, House of Mystery,
Yes.
House of Secrets. These were little 5 to 8 page stories. And I call them the vaudeville of comics. It's where you'd go to learn your craft.
Right.
And so I started submitting work to Paul, and I still have it. I've been meaning to, I want to scan it and put it online. The first letter I got back from Paul after I sent him in, like, I don't know, 3 or 4 different story ideas, where he just shredded my stories. He might as well have put it into a paper shredder, just tore them to pieces, criticized my typing, because this was the days of typewriters before
Right.
computers. So he didn't just hate my stories, he hated my typing. But 2 things. One, he took the time to do it. He took the time to read my work and go over my work and give me feedback. And then
Right.
at the end, even after not liking what I submitted to him, said, please feel free to submit again. So, I'm a young guy, hungry guy, creative guy, and all the criticism didn't bother me at all. It was like, the way my brain saw that letter was a bunch of words up here and then these giant words that said, please feel free to submit again. That's all I saw. So again, I would submit stuff. He'd give me some criticism, submit stuff, give me some criticism. Because I lived in New York City, I figured, let me go up there, make an appointment, and meet him face to face and pitch him some ideas face to face.
Right.
So I took the subway from Brooklyn into Manhattan. I went up to DC. I sat down with Paul. I pitched him a few ideas, and he liked one of them. And we started to talk about how I was going to do it. And he gave me certain rules and regulations for how to write a script. And I
Right.
went home and I wrote this script, and I came back and he went through the script, and I went back and I think I rewrote it one more time, and he liked it and he bought it. And I will never forget this. He reached out, he shook my hand, and he said, welcome to the business. And it was just one of the great moments of my career and probably of my life, because here was this dream and it had just come true. Finally, I'm in the door now and I'm a writer. It's great.
This is a wonderful, uh, wonderful for us, for all of us, because right now we just get agitated by the fact that if we are receiving rejections, even though we fail to realize that it doesn't require that much of a travel time. I've been to New York City and I know how far Brooklyn is from Manhattan, and it's not easy traveling back and forth with all your writings and getting it approved. And then finally, after having multiple meetings, you finally get accepted. So, Mr. DeMatteis, we learned that how you got into DC Comics. What was your first ever major superhero title that you worked on?
Let me think about that. Now, back in those days, there were a lot of DC had a bunch of books that were anthologies, not just the Weird War Tales, House of Mystery kind of stories, but the superhero books. World's Finest was multiple features. Detective Comics was multiple features. And I don't remember which one was first, but around the same time, I know I wrote Black Lightning for a while.
Right.
I wrote some Hawkman stories. My first Batman story was like a 12-page Batman story that was in Detective Comics. And then one of my favorites from back then was I did Aquaman with Dick Giordano and then Don Heck when Len Wein was editor. So there were a bunch of those, but they were all shorter stories. So, come out every month, but it would be a 12-page story every month instead of a 22-page story. And again, fantastic way to learn. You're not suddenly swamped with 22 pages. You're learning to structure, you're learning to write character, to move plot forward, to work with themes and do it within working within a constricted space is a great way to learn. When you give people too much freedom, especially in the beginning, you're floundering, you're not quite sure what to do. So to start with these smaller stories was a fantastic way to learn. And I had great teachers. There was Paul Levitz. There was another editor named Jack Harris that I did a lot of work for.
Legend.
And then Len Wein, who really became my mentor and dear friend. I mean, they were all friends. Paul, I'm still in touch with Paul after all these years. But Len, we had a very special relationship. Len was the guy who kind of looked at my work and said, "Oh, you have something really, really special going on here, and I want to help you nurture it, and I want to help you grow into this talent that I see there." And when you have someone like Len Wein sitting across the desk from you telling you that, it's really, really special.
For those listeners, for those viewers who are not aware of the late Len Wein, he is the co-creator of Wolverine and the giant size X-Men lineup, which had Wolverine, Sunspot, Storm, and later on he would be one of the best writers in DC Comics when it came to Justice League and other major characters.
And Swamp Thing with Bernie Wrightson, one of the great comics of all time. Yeah.
Swamp Thing, yes. So you are, sir, very lucky that you had the late Len Wein as your mentor, because
indeed.
I am a huge fan of him, and it's one of my regrets in life that I never got the chance to meet him.
And he was as talented as he was as a writer. That's how nice a human being he was. He was a really, really good guy, and we still miss him.
God rest his soul. Okay, so basically, you are writing these short stories about major superheroes, and did this process continue all the way till you were given the assignment to do a limited series for Dr. Fate in the 80s?
Oh, that was much later. Yeah. So we don't have to do, if we do my whole career, we're going to be here for like 6 weeks because it's a 40-year career. But the short version is that I continue to do that. I think my first full-length superhero story was an issue of Batman the Brave and the Bold. It was a Batman Hawkman team up.
Right.
And at the same time, while I'm doing all this other stuff, I'm sending samples over to Marvel.
Right.
And Jim Shooter had read my stuff.
Right.
And I was also still a journalist. So I was writing articles about comics and interviewing Paul Levitz and Jim Shooter and all these people. So I was getting to know them that way. But Shooter also read my work and saw something there that he liked. And he would give me fill-in issues to work on, most of which never saw print. But it was a great way to learn to do a one-issue story with a particular character.
Right.
And other jobs up at Marvel that he would throw my way. And then what happened at a certain point was that Shooter offered me a contract at Marvel. And it was one of the great moments, again, of my career, because Len wanted me to come on staff and be an assistant editor and work with him as his assistant.
Right.
Shooter offered me a freelance contract so I could still work from home. Right. So I'm like, oh my God, DC wants me and Marvel wants me. And this is like, I hadn't been in the business that long. So what a great place to be. And what happened was that my son had just been born around that time. Okay. And the choice was, well, if I take the freelance contract, I get to stay home and help raise my son and be here every day. Right. So as hard as it was not to take that job from Len, I made the decision based on raising my son, and it was a good decision. And then I was there at Marvel for, exclusively for about, I don't know, 4 or 5 years. And then after that, I started basically, I was a freelancer and I went back and forth and back and forth. I went back to DC. We started working on Justice League. That's when Dr. Fate came along,
Right.
and on for all these years.
The reason I basically wanted to touch upon Dr. Fate was because you are absolutely right. I mean, like, if we go into every detail of your career, then I think this podcast is going to go at least like 3 hours long, at least,
And
if
maybe
I'm
longer. Yeah.
so. But the reason was that at the time, two things were basically coming out of the comic book pages, because I read most of my comics, because the first comic I bought my dad bought me was in 1983. And in the late 80s, I would come across two ads in DC Comics. One would be Who's Watching the Watchmen? And the other one would be the Dr. Fate limited series.
Mm-hmm. Oh, the limited series with Keith Giffen, the first one, yeah.
With Keith Giffen. And I still remember the artwork of that ad. It was really frightening, and seeing Dr. Fate in the middle of it. And I was like, wow, man. I mean, this is like different sort of stuff, because this isn't Doctor Strange that I am used to. This is something else altogether. So was there a special liking, or was it like, for example, the people at DC Comics saw you as the ideal choice for a supernatural mystic character? What was it?
I pitched that character. I mean, as I remember, it took a long time too. I like the supernatural characters. I like the mystical characters because I like the kinds of stories you can tell with them. You get into the more metaphysical stuff. You can get into the more spiritual stuff. You can play with horror elements. You can do all kinds and really address big issues through these supernatural characters and their worlds. So, Doctor Strange may be, if not my favorite, in my top 2 Marvel characters for sure. And I was drawn to Dr. Fate because here's another character to get through that door. And I didn't know Dr. Fate as well. I don't think he had been as developed as Dr. Strange was. And I wrote up a proposal. I remember I pitched it to Dick Giordano, and I remembered there would be notes, and then I pitched it again. And I finally, Denny O'Neil was the editor, and Keith Giffen, turns out, loved Dr. Fate. I had never met Keith before. It must have overlapped us starting to work on Justice League International at the same time. But I really feel like the first thing we started working on, it just took longer, was Dr. Fate. But this was me writing and Keith drawing, as opposed to us co-writing together. Mm-hmm. But I also have to say, when Keith is drawing, he goes off and things come back in your story that you never expected to see. And he's so talented, it was fine. So I remember sitting at a lunch with Keith and with Denny, and all these ideas. I had my concept of what I wanted the character to be, and ideas were flying everywhere. And I remember getting home and thinking, we have so many great ideas, but we don't have a story yet. And I spent hours, and I was literally, I had a lot of property where I lived then. I was running in circles, thinking about this story, literally running in circles before I could go home and actually take all this and put it together into a coherent story. And that was a really, really, really great miniseries. And that's what led to a 2-year run on Dr. Fate with Sean McManus, which may be one of my single favorite things I've ever done.
I have a very, I don't know what should I label this question, but I personally feel that DC Comics has a cultural problem whereby they have the largest portfolio of superheroes going back to the golden age of comics, but they still haven't figured it out on how to keep on publishing them, keeping them relevant, keeping the readers excited about them, because it's not based on what you shared. Forgive me if I understood it incorrectly, but this is something that I really feel that there are a lot of characters that are stuck in DC's vault somewhere, and they don't pay good amount of attention to bring those characters out. They are just stuck within this trinity of Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. The maximum these guys can go is the Justice League members. Am I right to say that? Because you've worked with them.
Yeah, I don't know if that's true. I'm someone who's always attracted to the more obscure characters too. Yeah. That's one of the reasons our Justice League worked so well when I was, co-writing with Keith and working with Kevin McGuire, was that they gave us all these, quote, second-tier characters, the B characters, not the A characters. And because we got the B characters, we could make them our own and play with them and have fun and write them however we wanted to. If we had had Superman, Batman, Flash, Wonder Woman, Green Lantern, every other editor in the place would have been over our shoulder telling us, you can't do that, you can't do that, you can't do that, We were lucky that Denny O'Neil gave us Batman and said, go have fun and play, So I think, there are sort of ignored, obscure characters at all companies. And all it takes is the right writer to come along with the right take on that character, and that B-level character becomes an A-level character. Even look at the movies, Guardians of the Galaxy. That's like D-level. No one, the average. You ask the average person on the street before those movies came out, who were the Guardians of the Galaxy? They wouldn't know what you were talking about.
True. They
did it right, and now everybody knows the Guardians of the Galaxy. So it all depends on what you bring to the table. I don't think it's a DC problem. I think it's just a problem. It's not even a problem. It's just the truth. There's so many characters that some are going to get shunted to the side. And the truth is, it's a business. So if Batman's what's going to really sell, we're going to put out 30 Batman titles. If Spider-Man's what's going to sell, we're going to put out 30 Spider-Man titles. It just works that way. And then someone comes along with the right take on this obscure character over there, and suddenly they're a best-selling character. So you just never know.
Fair point. I just have one thing to add here, is that after your stint on Dr. Fate, I don't recall any other major Dr. Fate series, be it an ongoing or a limited series, that would be so much revered and impactful that came along. Whereas in Marvel, for example, in the 80s, we knew Dakota North. Then she disappeared. Then she came back. Same goes for Luke Cage. He disappeared briefly, then came back in the 90s, then disappeared a bit briefly, and then, Marvel keeps on trying. But DC, this is something I feel personally that, they just are good at forgetting about their characters.
I think there have been several Dr. Fate series since then. I know Steve Gerber did one. Paul Levitz, I think, did one not that long ago. I think the character just has never gotten enough traction from the readers. But I think it's a great character. And of course, it's a character, when we did it, especially what we did was we completely remade the character and brought in a couple that came together to be Dr. Fate and all these other interesting things. And the great thing with that helmet is it can move around and someone else can be Dr. Fate.
True.
So I think it's, that's a character I could probably return to if given an opportunity. It would be fun to do Dr. Fate again, but totally different than what I did before. Because that's the great thing about that Dr. Fate run, was we got to tell a story and actually end it. When Sean and I were working on the ongoing series, it was 2 years. There was a beginning, a middle, and end. Our characters left, and Kent Nelson was back, and they went off and they told more stories without us after that. But our story was complete. And you rarely get to tell a complete story in comics because it's so serialized and the character has to be there the next month. They let us really do that, to build up something new and then dismantle it when we were done. It was great. It was really good. I had so much freedom on that book.
Okay, sir. Now I want to shed light on your career at Marvel.
Okay.
And you mentioned a very important name because he also happens to be one of my favorite editors-in-chief in Marvel history, Jim Shooter.
Mm-hmm.
So what kind of a person he was? Was he like a similar mentor type of an individual like Len Wein? Was he more like the Paul Levitz type, or as John Byrne famously said, that the problem with Jim Shooter was that if he always wanted to fix things, even if there weren't things that required fixing. So the truth is in between.
Yes, the truth is always in between. Jim was a complex guy. I think he He alienated a lot of people. He also helped a lot of people. He brought a lot of really incredibly positive changes to Marvel. My
Right.
relationship with him overall was a very good one. He brought me over there. He was a great teacher. He really understood story. He taught me a lot. And whatever disagreements we had later on down the line, when I weigh the good and the bad,
Yeah.
for me, the good outweighs the bad. It was overall, it was a very good experience that I had with Jim, and until it wasn't, and that was fine. But you know what? Here's the truth. A lot of that gets put on Jim. But you see over the years, there's two things. One is anyone that's in a position of power,
Yeah.
whether they're the editor-in-chief, they're the publisher, by the very nature of that job, they're just going to alienate people.
True.
Half the people are going to love them and half the people aren't,
True.
And the other thing is human beings are complex. We're not all one thing or another. And Jim was a lot of different things. And sometimes he had his hands too deep in the pie and he didn't give people enough room to breathe. But at the other hand, like I said, he brought so much to Marvel and really got the trains running on time there, and really taught a lot of people, and he had a vision.
Right.
I've worked for certain editorial types who have no vision, and they're going to sit down with you and tell you what's right and wrong with your story, and they don't really know anything. Jim, whether you agreed with his vision or not, I always respected that he had a vision.
Right.
He had something in his mind that he wanted. And it was his job to execute that vision. And I think sometimes he did it brilliantly and sometimes he didn't. But, if I was in that job, it would be the same thing.
True.
I would do it. I would be, some people would like me, some people wouldn't like me. It's just the nature of life. It's just the nature of life, especially when you're in power and you have to make decisions about giving someone work or not giving someone work, or this story is acceptable or this story isn't, or I want this changed and this is okay. Those kind of decisions are always going to alienate somebody along the way. It just is. It's just the nature of it.
Perfectly understandable, sir, and perfectly relatable for all of us. Now, you get hired, and did Jim give you Spider-Man from the get-go, or
no? The first regular assignments after these fill-ins that I got from Jim, my first one was the Defender. No, the first one was Conan, believe it or not.
Okay.
I had to follow Roy Thomas on Conan. Here, Roy Thomas is doing this extraordinary work for a decade. Right. And here's the new guy here, right? Conan. And it was like so intimidating. It was just, and then the other book that he gave me, and he said, I know you like Doctor Strange, so he gave me the Defenders. And amazing. Defenders, I loved. Defenders was, because Defenders had a reputation at Marvel, primarily because of Steve Gerber, of the quirky book, the book where you could make it your own and do weird things. And so I just wrote the kind of stories that I wanted to write. And it allowed me to kind of exercise my writing muscles and do things that were different. And in a way, it was a rehearsal for my own creator-owned work that came soon after that. So I loved working on that. And then one thing led to another, and Captain America came soon after, and then, Ghost Rider, and then we were off, and I was, writing everything in sight from there.
Okay. So we have you writing Conan, we have you writing Defenders, and now there is something very interesting that you tweeted recently, and I took a screenshot of it. For me, a great story isn't about plot. It's about the characters, peeling back the tops of their heads, rooting around in their psyches, finding the emotional core, the psychological truth. The plot will form around that. Without the core, all plot in the world won't matter.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I write from the character out. Sometimes a great plot idea will come, but even if you have the greatest plot idea in the world, we as an audience want to go on a journey with people that we know and can relate to. And especially with these characters that have been around forever, if you want to make them interesting, the only way to make them interesting is to dig into their heads and find things in there. I always, like I said, I imagine it's like you peel back their heads, you get a flashlight, you start looking, oh, no one's ever talked about that part of their psyche before, and find new things to say so that we can relate to them as real three-dimensional people. And once the reader or the writer hooks into that character in an emotional way, we'll go on any journey in the world with them. If we're not hooked into those characters, if we can't relate to those characters, I don't care how amazing your story is. It may entertain me for a few minutes, but I'm not going to come back month after month or week after week on a TV show or whatever it may be, unless those characters are real and mean something to me and reflect some truth of my own psyche.
Okay. How much classic literature actually shaped this approach of yours? Because Kraven's Last Hunt, a wonderful story, is borrowing a great deal of influence from Dostoevsky.
Yeah, Dostoevsky I discovered in high school. So I was always, I wasn't just reading comic books. I was reading everything in sight. I was reading science fiction. I was reading, if in school I got turned on to Dickens and Dostoevsky or whatever great literature we're reading. Right. I just loved reading, and I just loved story. And when I discovered Dostoevsky when I was in high school, we read Crime and Punishment, and that affected me like no other book I had ever read before, I don't think. And then my teacher knew how much I had loved that, and he handed me a copy of the Brothers Karamazov one day and said, "Here, go home and read this." Right. And that just, my head just exploded, And what we respond to in art are the things that are truths inside us. So I was always fascinated by and kind of tormented by the fact that, we're all filled with opposites. We're not just one, kind of what we're saying when we're talking about Shooter or about any of us. We're not just one thing or another. We all have opposites. We all have that pull of opposites. And sometimes that pull is very painful, in ourselves, and when we see it in other people, who's someone's one way, then they're another, because we're very complex. And Dostoevsky always addressed that so profoundly and so deeply. And I responded to that. And I think as a kid, when you're growing up in the world and you're looking at the adults around you, they're just like what we're talking about. Some of the adults in your world are capable of incredible love and kindness, and other adults in your world may be capable of some very dark, unpleasant things. So you want to understand them, and you want to understand their psyches. And I took, none of this was conscious, but I took all that with me as a writer. So when you look at these so-called villains in comics, it's the same thing. And I've said many times that I think writing the villains is a great exercise in compassion, because you have to look at someone who's allegedly, quote, bad, right, and really look into their mind and their heart and understand what made them that way. And the minute you understand them, you can't hate them. You may still oppose what they stand for, but you can't hate them. In fact, you will have compassion for them. So, writing these kind of characters becomes an exercise in compassion that I think, and reading about them, I think, is an exercise in compassion that I hope we could take out into our lives when we look at other people. The world is so polarized, good, bad, up, down. We don't like them, we hate them, blah, blah, blah. But all those people are people. And what can we do, even if we oppose what they stand for, to understand them, and maybe in that understanding, open up some doorway between them? So with Kraven, who is this character? Why does he run around in these leopard skin pants trying to kill Spider-Man? Right. What's in his head? And the thing that hooked me was I never really liked Kraven. I never thought he was that much of an interesting character. But in the Marvel Universe handbook, someone, I don't know whether it was ever in a story or someone just made it up while they were filling out the page, they said that Kraven was Russian. Yes. So Kraven's Russian. And all of a sudden the Dostoevsky part of my brain goes, oh, I totally know who this guy is. And off I went, and the whole story just went,
I have to admit that my view about Kraven was mainly formed because I was introduced to Kraven the Hunter from the 1981 Spider-Man animated series, not with the comics. Comics came afterwards. And the animated series was just like you were alluding to, that we have this thing that, okay, there's this good and there's this bad. Kraven was a bad guy, but this book is like my favorite reading companion. Anytime I'm just looking to read something that makes me realize that why shouldn't we not be judgmental towards others? No matter how bad a person is, we have to always keep ourselves in check. Another thing is that your work on Spider-Man was, I read the most. And I realized that you had the best exercise when it came to exploring the emotional side, not only of the villain, but also the hero himself.
Mm-hmm.
Am I wrong to say that you had a special connection with Spider-Man and Spider-Verse when it came about?
Yeah, no, you're right. What I was saying before with Captain America, you know, there's you as a reader enjoying these characters, and there's you as a writer. Now, I always liked Spider-Man. You know, I always enjoyed and read Spider-Man, but writing Peter Parker, something else happened. You know, there becomes a connection between the writer and the character. It's almost like a mind meld. I pour all of myself into Peter. I take Peter into me, and this third entity shows up, which is my version of Peter Parker.
Right.
And I've said this many times before. In some ways, I know Peter Parker and Ben Reilly better than I know some of my friends, because I know everything that's going on in their heads. It's a very intimate connection. I really don't think of them as fictional characters. I think of them as real people. And you have to think of them as real people when you write these stories. You have to invest them with all the reality that you know. You have to be shameless as a writer. You have to say things in your stories and through your characters that maybe you would never say to your best friend, but you can express it through the stories. And there was absolutely a mind meld with Peter, and I understood that character and loved that character, and still do to this day. And Ben Reilly as well. I just recently did this Ben Reilly Spider-Man series. It came out, I think the collected edition came out in early July, and writing Ben again after all these years was like a reunion with one of my oldest and dearest friends.
How painful was it for you to write Best of Enemies? Emotional.
Painful. It was, it was, I don't know if I'd say it was painful, but it was certainly emotional because the whole story ran on emotion. But from a writing point of view, from a storytelling point of view,
yeah,
it was the best story to tell, because we did that really over 2 years, the whole Harry Peter story. And so what better story to tell from a storytelling point of view than the story of two best friends who are also mortal enemies? So they're trying on one level to destroy each other, but the whole time they still love each other and need each other. You know, talk about the perfect formula for drama, you know. So that story, you just followed the characters and it wrote itself. It was, I loved working with an artist like Sal Buscema. Oh my God. Just like working with Mike Zeck on Kraven's Last Hunt. Doesn't get better than that. Just doesn't get better.
To me, it felt like almost a Shakespearean kind of a story when I read Best of Enemies. And
yeah, very, very high drama, very high drama.
Very high drama. But equally, you weren't done with that, because I think as a reader, this is just my personal opinion. I'm not saying it's presenting it as a fact. But the most heartbreaking story for me was The Amazing Spider-Man number 400.
Yeah, the death of Aunt May. That was a tough one. That was a very emotional story to write. Very emotional. And I'm glad that it's a story that has held up and lasted all these years. Another one of the great moments of my career was when that story came out. I came home one day and I turned on my answering machine, and there was a message from John Romita Sr., who was my favorite Spider-Man artist, saying that he had read that story and that it brought him to tears. So it doesn't get better than that. It really doesn't get better than that. And Mark Bagley did such a beautiful job on that story too. I'm very lucky that throughout my career, I have worked with some of the most extraordinary artists out there.
I just wanted to say that thank you for sharing this story of John Romita Sr. actually leaving a message, because for me, it feels like I wasn't the only one who was very depressed when I read The Amazing Spider-Man number 400.
A lot of people, you know, I go to conventions, and people will say, oh, you know, my grandmother died around the same time that I read that story, or I lost my parent, and it really resonated with them. You know, it's a universal thing. We're all, you know, the minute you're alive, you're thinking about death and loss. And so those stories have a lot of impact for people if you do it right, if you don't do it in a cheap way. And the last thing we wanted to do with Aunt May's death was do it in a cheap way. I wanted it to be a story that had a real emotional reality, because it certainly affected me writing it, and I'm glad to hear that it affected the people that read it too.
If you are still in touch with Mr. Mark Bagley, uh, please tell him that the last panel where Aunt May finally dies and Peter is hugging her and crying, I still feel emotional describing it.
It was a beautiful page. Yeah, Peter's like laying his head on her too. Yeah.
It's possibly like I don't know, maybe like the second biggest panel moment since the death of Gwen Stacy, in my opinion.
Yeah, it was very, very special story, and Mark did a beautiful, beautiful job with it. And when we get to the Kickstarter, that's one of the great things about this Kickstarter is I'm working with 4 of my favorite artists and a bunch of my other favorite artists who are doing covers for us. And it's just, I'm surrounded by all this extraordinary talent that just, it's comics. If you don't have the right artwork, it doesn't matter how great your story is, it's going to fall apart. And to work with these incredibly gifted visual storytellers is a real blessing.
Mr. DeMatteis, after successful stints at DC and Marvel, why did it occur to you so late to start your own?
Well, first of all, it's not occurring to me so late because I've been doing my own creator-owned work since the 80s, starting with Moonshadow and Blood at Epic Comics. I was part of the beginning of Vertigo Comics at DC and Paradox Press, and I've worked for IDW and other companies. So I've always done my own creator-owned series along the way.
Right, sir.
And so that part is not new. What's new is Kickstarter, which I've never tried before. And you're always looking for new venues to get your stories out into the world. And what appealed to me about Kickstarter was the fact that it's a way to reach the audience without anyone else in between. Usually there's like some big publishing machine in between. And this, you go straight to the readers with the material, and it's you and them on this journey together, which I found kind of fascinating. But I never really had the will to do it because it seemed like, aside from the creative work, there's a lot of work running a Kickstarter. No. So I have a friend named David Baldy. He's a TV writer and a producer, and we met a few years ago and became friends. And he offered essentially to become my partner in this endeavor and run this thing. So we're working on it together. And he said, well, let's do a Kickstarter together and see what happens. And he created this Spellbound Comics imprint specifically for this.
Right.
And so we were talking about the various ideas I have. And like any writer, I got a stack of them. I'm always working on new ideas. Sometimes you work on them for 10 or 15 years before you sell them, And so I pitched him like 4 different ideas. And David's idea was, well, let's do them all.
Right.
So it went from being let's kickstart one idea to let's put out 4 different books, 4 different genres, 4 different types of story with 4 different artists. We've got wonderful artists doing alternate covers. We have Liam Sharp and Kevin McGuire and Dustin Yen and I know I'm forgetting somebody. J.H. Williams III, all these great artists coming along with us. And so we're launching these 4 books on Kickstarter. We're in our final week now. So the final week is always sort of the energy starts to flag. So we really need to get people excited again and come. But it's been going really, really well. We've had some great success. We met our initial goal in about 6 hours. So we're building on that. And the fun of it is we're putting out 4 new series, and anyone that through Kickstarter or through the Spellbound Comics website supports all 4 or buys the collected edition that will have all 4, they get to vote and say which of these 4 books will be the first one that will take to series. And then we will do another Kickstarter with that one to complete a 4 or 5 issue miniseries. So it's really, really exciting. Like I said, I've been doing this a long time, and this is one of the most exciting projects I've ever been involved in.
One thing I was really happy to see was that when I came across your Kickstarter campaign on Twitter, I saw a great deal of former and current Marvel DC writers who are supporting this Kickstarter. And this is something which is much needed. But the thing that really made me happy was that Mr. Tom DeFalco has joined your team.
Well, what Tom is doing, I don't want to give people the wrong impression. Tom's not writing any of the books. I'm writing all the books.
You're writing.
What Tom is doing is we're going to put together, there'll be the 4 books, and then there'll be a collected edition.
Right.
The collected edition will have all 4 books. I'm writing introductions to each of the stories to explain where the ideas came from. We'll have art and scripts and all kinds of fun things in the back. And Tom is writing the foreword to the collected edition.
Amazing.
So David, my partner, said, so, who should we get to write the foreword? He said, his question was, if you were being inducted into a Hall of Fame, who would you want to have induct you? And I thought, well, I've worked with Tom on and off since about 1980 at Marvel. Right. And Tom, over the years, has become a good friend. We're not just professional friends, we're friends. And he's a great guy. And he certainly knows me and respects my work just as I know and respect his work. And so he agreed to write the foreword for the collection, which is a wonderful thing.
Amazing. And now I would like you to just basically introduce us all 4 comics title. Especially, I was highly impressed where one of the artists paid homage to the late George Perez with the cover.
With the cover of Any Man, right? We did an homage to the Crisis on Infinite Earth's Superman Supergirl cover. Yeah,
exactly.
I'll start with that one. It's called Any Man. Mm-hmm. The artist is David. I have to say, every single one of these artists is just phenomenal. I mean, I am so lucky to be working with this level of talent. So David Baldion, David drew the Ben Reilly series that we were just talking about that just came out a few months ago. And we got along so well working on that he was one of the first people I said, oh, David, do you want to work with us on this? And he was in from the get-go. So Any Man is probably, on the surface at least, the closest to a traditional superhero story. But all of these stories are very big. Any Man takes place over the course of like 50 years. It starts in New York City in 1969. A portal opens, and through the portal comes this costume figure who says that he's come from millions of years in the past. Right. He's from an ancient utopian civilization, a perfect golden age. But what happened was their hubris got the better of them. They reached too high. Everything came crashing down. And he has now come to 1969, which he says is the crisis point in our history as a planet. Right. Not just as an American culture, but as a planet, to save us from the fate that befell his world millions of years in the past. Wow. And he goes on and becomes a global hero. One of the important things about this character is he's not a New York hero. He's not an American hero. He's a global hero. Right. And he becomes that to the whole world. Everyone looks up to him. When we were talking earlier about characters like Superman and Captain America that reflect the best in us, that's what Any Man becomes. The only problem is that everything he's said about who he is, where he's come from, is a total lie. Wow. So the story becomes, well, so who is he? Why is he here? Who created him, and what's his agenda? And we play that out over a 50-year span. And that's the premise of Any Man. So we'll leave that at that. Okay. And wisdom. And the alternate cover for Any Man is done by Kevin McGuire, my old buddy from Justice League International. Right. Wisdom. So I said all these stories are different genres. Wisdom is a supernatural Western. Okay. When I was a kid growing up in New York, Westerns were everywhere. Half the shows on television in the United States were Westerns. Yes. And then you'd go to the movies, and half the movies that were coming out were Westerns. And so as I have a picture of myself at like 4 years old in a cowboy outfit with a cowboy hat and riding my plastic horse, Right. So that was a big part of my childhood. Then in growing up, I kind of forgot about it. And as I've said before, stories tend to come to me as movies in my mind. So one morning I was laying in bed, eyes closed, and this movie starts playing. And there's a guy on a horse. Oh, it's a Western. And then I follow him. Where's it going? It's a supernatural Western. And this whole story evolved. I call it, did the TV show Deadwood, did that reach your part of the world? Are you familiar with that one? Yeah. I'm not personally familiar, but yes, Deadwood did reach us. Yeah, so I call it Deadwood meets Lord of the Rings, in the sense that it's, on the one hand, it's a gritty Western. Right. But the main character is sort of we're talking about Dr. Fate, Dr. Strange. He's a sorcerer of the Old West. He was a gunslinger, he's a sorcerer, and he's been tasked with protecting the world from this great evil that's coming. But along with that, his wife and his daughter have been taken from him by this same force. So it's a very personal quest to find and redeem his wife and his daughter while he's trying to protect the world from this dark wave that's coming. And it's a big epic story. I see it not just as one 5-issue miniseries, but probably 3 of them before the whole story is told, And the art for this one is by Tom Mandrake. If you know DC going back to the 80s, Tom worked on Batman. I think his most famous work is probably his work on The Spectre.
Yes.
With John Ostrander. And nobody does supernatural and spooky better than Tom. And he's also really good at doing Westerns. So he was just the perfect guy to do this. Perfect guy to do this. And the artwork, I'll probably say this about all these guys. I think the work they're doing on these books is some of the best work of their career. What Tom has done on Wisdom is just gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous work. And the alternate cover for that is by Dustin Yen. And Dustin, I hope I'm saying your name right. We just previewed the cover this past week on Twitter, and it's an amazing, really spooky cover that he came up with.
Okay, now we've done 2. The third one that whose title caught my attention big time was Layla and
Layla in the Lands of After.
In the Lands of After.
Yeah.
So, what's this story that we're looking at?
This is a story that's been in my head for about 12 years now, and I've been talking to the artist Sean McManus about it probably for 12 years. To go back to what we were talking before, Sean and I worked on Dr. Fate for 2 years, one of my favorite collaborators, and a guy who's so talented, and he just keeps getting better and better and better as the years pass. I think he's at the top of his game right now. So the basic story is a 13-year-old girl, Layla, is riding her bike home from her friend's house one chilly October night in upstate New York, and going down this hill, and all of a sudden she's engulfed in this light that comes from out of nowhere, and it lifts her up, and her bike falls away, and she's carried. Is it over the rainbow? Is it through the looking glass? She lands in this magical land where the rivers sing and the trees have consciousness and the animals talk, and it's like, oh, where am I? What is this incredible place? And then along comes this cat that looks awfully familiar to her, and she realizes this is her cat who died like 5 years ago. And then along comes this man, and she realizes this is her grandfather who also passed away. And this is not Oz. This is not Wonderland. This is the afterlife. And what that light was that gathered around her was the light of the car that ran her down.
Oh.
So she's dead, and she's in the afterlife. And she decides, I'm only 13 years old. I'm too young to die, and we're going to find a way to get me back before it's too late. So with her grandfather and with her cat, with another character called the Not Quite Fallen Angel, and other people that she meets along the way, she begins this quest to get back before that window of opportunity closes.
Impressive. It's like Alice in the Wonderland, but in the afterlife. It's not Wonderland.
Yeah, exactly. And then, because it's about the afterlife, we get to explore these spiritual themes that we were talking about. One of the things that we deal with is in my conception, everybody gets, the afterlife is composed of mind and imagination. So everyone gets the afterlife that they expect at first.
Yes.
So if you expect angels with wings playing harps, floating on clouds, you're going to get that. If you're someone who's filled with guilt and shame and thinks you deserve to be punished, you could end up in a hell of your own making.
True.
Or if maybe what you think heaven is to be 10 years old again, playing in the streets, playing ball with your friends. That will be the heaven that you get. And so they're called the lands of after because there are as many lands as there are souls in the afterlife. So she's journeying through many, many lands before she gets back.
Beautiful concept. And the fourth one
is called Godsend. Although as the artist Matthew Dow Smith calls it, God's End. My title for it was Godsend, and he keeps calling it God's End, and I realized that both titles work for the story. So Matt and I have known each other for some time. We worked together on a Batman story, on a Star Trek story, but we really have wanted to do something big together. And this is another story that's really, really big. the joy of this is also the frustration of this, because we're putting out the first issues, and I know where these stories are going to go, and I know how many new characters are coming and how big the story is going to get. So I cannot wait to continue these. So Godsend, the main character is his name is Eric Small. He's in his mid-30s. He's a teacher. He's sort of overweight, depressed, had a really, really rough childhood, doesn't have a lot of friends, really does not have a good life. Completely smitten with one of the teachers at school that he can't even find the courage to ever talk to her. Lives a sort of a gray, small life. He's sort of the embodiment. Everybody, I think all of us to some degree have a little guy in the back of our head who is the voice of all our fears and insecurities.
Right.
Oh, I'm not good enough. I'm too small. I don't have power. I don't deserve this, whatever. Eric is sort of the embodiment of all of that. So into this world descends this celestial being, the celestial blue-skinned being that the media calls Godsend, because he shows up at this one point and does something that seems like he was sent by God. But people don't really know where he came from, what he's doing here. Is he here for good? Is he here to save the world? Is he here to destroy the world? But Eric becomes obsessed with Godsend. He's always watching the news. He's reading articles and printing them out. He's just, that's all he thinks about is Godsend. It consumes his life. And then one day in his living room, he looks up and there's this 7-foot tall being with a turtle's body and a man's head. He says, "Get on my back." And Eric is like, "What? Get on my back? What do you do when a giant turtle shows up in your house? You get on his back."
Right.
Flies him out the window. And this is the beginning of reality as he understands it being shredded for Eric. Not just reality, but his own sense of his self, his smallness, who he is, begins to transform, and the story becomes something very, very different from there. I love these stories that deal with I love Kirby's New Gods. I love, because when you deal with those God-like characters, you're essentially dealing with the God inside all of us, and projecting that outward. And this story deals with those themes. It deals with the themes of who we think we are versus who we really are, what we think reality is versus what it really is. I call it, my half joking one-liner is Jack Kirby's Gods meets The Matrix meets Philip K. Dick. So it's sort of, that pretty much explains it, I think.
I think from what I have understood and what the feeling I get is that these, and as I would like to inform my viewers and listeners, that this project is very deeply rooted in the philosophical and metaphysical world.
Yes.
It's a breath of fresh air in the world of comics. And for this industry to survive, such great ideas are absolutely essential. And we can't thank you enough that you took out the time to share with us this wonderful project that you have kickstarted.
Yes, and I want to say that all the books are available digitally. Like, I know, you're part of the world. Just the postage, from the United States could be a lot of money. But they're all available digitally. The collection will be available digitally. So please, if you're at all interested, we have one more week to go. Come on aboard and join us on this journey, because it's really been incredibly exciting.
Guys, you can check out the Kickstarter link in the description below, as well as the official website, as well as social channels for Spellbound Comics in the description of this video. Mr. DeMatteis, before I let you go, I want to ask you two very important questions.
Okay.
Okay, and one of those questions is very important for the community here. But I'll start with the semi-final.
Okay.
Being a renowned writer of comic books, which writer from the comic book industry influenced you the most?
Wow.
Your inspiration, your favorite?
I can't pick one. I'll give you 4. How's that?
Please do, because I totally understand your position, sir.
Yeah, I mean, it's and it's always the stuff that you're reading when you're a reader. Do you know what I mean? Not yeah. There's so many great writers that came along when I was in the business and since I've been in the business. But the people that impact you the most are the people that you're reading when you're a reader. So certainly Lee and Kirby, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. Because I consider Kirby a writer. Kirby was not just an artist. He was an incredible writer. I think if anyone in the history of comics can be called a genius, it's Jack Kirby.
No doubt.
And those New Gods comics at DC in the 70s are probably my favorite comics of all time. And Stan Lee, brilliant guy who brought a whole, breath of fresh air to comics in the way that he wrote these characters. So Lee and Kirby, certainly separately and together. Steve Gerber's stuff, when I was, I started reading comics when I was little, and then suddenly, you're a teenager and you could maybe give this stuff up. But when you had people like Steve Gerber who were taking the form and just exploding it and doing things within the context of the Marvel universe that had never been done before, that were so psychological and emotional, things that we're talking about, that were so interesting, it kept me reading comics. So Gerber was a huge, huge influence. And finally, to go back to what we were talking about before, Len Wein, both as a writer and as an editor and as a person. Was a tremendous influence on me. I remember reading Swamp Thing for the first time, and I was like, I have never read a comic book that reads like this before. It was so dripping in mood and so poetic, and it reminded me of, almost like Ray Bradbury, one of my favorite writers, And then to work with Len one-on-one as my editor, just Len was a tremendous influence on me as well. So those are the influences I would pick, and I'm sure I'm forgetting 100 of them.
No, definitely. But it's just like you listed out the four top of your favorites. It's a wonderful tribute to them, as well as to those who weren't named here, because obviously the world of comics is very rich. It's an 80-year-old history.
Yeah.
Okay. Last question. Will JMD Matteis be interested to be part of a Comic Con in Saudi Arabia?
Oh yeah, I would love that. Now I have to say that I have one qualification. Since COVID reared its head, I haven't been to a convention since the end of 2019. So it's been a while.
Right.
I'm hoping that next year, if things settle down a little bit, because I'm very careful about this stuff. I know a lot of people are going back to conventions, and then they're all coming. Half of them are coming home with COVID still. Right. So when the world resumes its normal shape, I think that would be a great thing to do. One of the things my wife and I have enjoyed so much in recent years, there have been so many more international conventions, and we've gotten to travel all over the world. And so to come to Saudi Arabia, I would love to do that and see your country, see your culture. That would be fantastic.
It would be an honor for us to be able to host you. Thank you so much for giving us the time.
It's a pleasure. It's such a great thing to be able to talk to a whole corner of the comic book world that I've never had a chance to talk to before. That's fantastic. I'm
really glad that you had that you enjoyed this session. For me, I'm really ecstatic because I got the chance to talk to one of the writers whose work I grew up reading, and I as well as my listeners, my viewers, the community here who loves comics, who loves Spider-Man, who love DC Comics, we can't be more thankful to you for giving us the time.
Oh, it was a genuine pleasure. Thank you so much.
Have a great day, sir.
See you too. Bye-bye.
Bye.